Voter suppression by conservatives is a time-honored tradition. Conservatives created poll taxes and literacy tests in order to keep the people they wanted to continue to oppress from having their say in elections. In order for the GOP coup to continue, voter suppression would need to continue as well. This means, first and foremost, making sure that the people casting votes are as old and as white as possible. Let's look at a few examples of Republican voter suppression. The first collection of examples are brought to you by the ruling in Shelby versus Holder, a narrow ruling in 2013 that overturned Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that required pre-clearance by the federal government in states listed in Section 5 before certain changes to voting could be made. The ruling, authored by Justice Roberts, basically makes the argument that because there have not been examples of widespread disenfranchisement that caused the need for the law to be created, that there is no reason for the law to continue. This is like arguing that because the Mississippi River hasn't flooded New Orleans for years, that we no longer need the levees built to protect New Orleans from river water. And, as one might suspect, the floodgates were opened with Shelby versus Holder. States couldn't wait to pass new laws and new policies since they now did not need pre-clearance to do so. In fact, in 2011, Governor Rick Perry of Texas signed voter ID legislation into law, and because of pre-clearance, this requirement was blocked and could not take effect. But once Shelby overturned the pre-clearance requirements, Texas was now free to implement the laws immediately. In 2013, the Republican-led legislature in North Carolina passed House Bill 589, a so-called voter ID law. However, the text of the law was not strictly limited to the requirement to present photo identification in order to cast a legal ballot in the state. The law prevents pre-registration of voters, same-day voter registration, and various other measures that have nothing to do with the requirement to have an ID to vote. The law also charges a fee to get an ID to vote if you don't already have one, despite the Constitution prohibiting poll taxes. However, there was one thing many of these measures had in common. They targeted the way voters who are black registered and voted. The law was eventually overturned. In seeking to suppress black voters from casting ballots, the GOP-led legislature investigated various ways that people voted. They took the ones that were most utilized by black voters and eliminated them. According to the ruling, the new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision, and the provisions in the law impose cures for problems that did not exist. In 2015, Wisconsin started enforcing its so-called voter ID law. This law was also not simply restricted to the requirement of showing a voter ID. It also cut back on early voting, required people to live in the ward that they voted in for 28 days prior to voting, and prohibited emailing absentee ballots to voters. Analysis of the Wisconsin law changes done by Priorities USA showed that the turnout in Wisconsin was 200,000 less than it would have been without the new laws. As a reminder, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by just under 23,000 votes. The set of all voters who cast a ballot in 2016 in Wisconsin was 6.1% more Republican and 5.7% less Democratic than the group of all voters lost to the new restrictions. If you compare states that made ID requirements stricter or less strict or had no change, the states with no change saw 1.3% higher turnout in 2016 and 2012. States with non-strict requirements saw an increase of 0.7%. But in states that changed to a stricter voter ID requirement, turnout dropped between 2012 and 2016 by 1.7%. The evidence is clear. These voter ID laws are not about protecting elections. They are about disenfranchising voters. A slurry of them appeared as soon as a favorable ruling was made by the activist conservative Supreme Court. If voting is indeed a right, as it is stated several times in the Constitution, states should be bending over backwards to enable the citizenry to vote. But evidence shows that elections with higher turnout, especially higher turnout among people who are not white, are not good for Republicans. And if they want to continue their minority rule, they have shown that they will continue to make it harder for legitimate voters to cast a ballot. Stay tuned for part 3 of the GOP Coup series, Voter Purges, which should be coming shortly. Remember, if you like this video series, please share the playlist, subscribe to the channel, and consider supporting the podcast via the Patreon. Thank you.